Chapter 1. Introduction: Why France's History Has Shaped Europe. Imagine a place where history is set in stone. The boulevards of Paris, the castles of the Loire, the cathedrals of Chartres and Reims, the battlefields of Verdun. France is a country that has shaped Europe like no other, politically, culturally, militarily. Anyone who tells the story of France is not only telling the history of a country, but also the history of the continent. Because France has always been more than just a neighboring state. It was rival and partner, role model and opponent, teacher and challenger. From the Gauls to the Frankish kings, from the Revolution to the European Union, France was always at the center of the great upheavals. So why is it worth telling 1,500 years of French history? Because in it we find answers to questions that still concern us today. How does a nation come into being? What does freedom mean? How does a society deal with power, religion, war, and progress? France is a country of extremes. Here, the absolute monarchy was unfolded in a splendor that was unparalleled. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a symbol of world aspirations. But it was also here that the revolution began, which shook the foundations of all monarchies. France brought Europe the ideas of the Enlightenment, but also the guillotine. It gave the world Napoleon, one of the greatest generals, but also wars that cost millions of lives. French history is a succession of splendor and catastrophe, of innovation and destruction. And it is precisely these contrasts that make them so fascinating. You can look at it like a journey. From the Celtic Gauls who challenged Julius Caesar to the Gauls from the Asterix comics who are now a humorous symbol of national pride. From Charlemagne, who was crowned in Aachen and saw Europe under a banner, even if only for a short time, to Louis XIV, who staged himself as the center of the world. From the battles of the Revolution, which cried out the call for freedom, equality, and fraternity, to the two world wars, in which France staggered between victory and devastation. And in the end, in our time, there is a country that, despite all its wounds, has remained one of Europe's defining powers, a democracy with a rich culture, economic strength, and international weight. France's history is not just a chronicle of kings, generals, and presidents. It is also the story of its people, the farmers who had to pay taxes in the Middle Ages, the citizens of Paris who erected barricades in 1789, the workers who took to the streets in 1968, and the young generation which today is looking for its place between tradition and modernity. That's why we start our journey with a look far back, to a time before France even existed, to an era in which wild tribes and Roman legions shaped the country. Before France became France, it was Gaul. Chapter 2. Gaul and the Romans. Before there was a France, before kings ruled Paris or revolutionaries stormed the Bastille, the country we know today was a mosaic of tribes, forests, rivers, and villages. Gaul. Gaul was not a unified state, but a patchwork of Celtic tribes. The helmets did not shine in lockstep, but each clan had its own customs, its own gods, its own princes. Some were warlike, others peaceful. Some formed alliances, others waged endless feuds against each other. And yet they were united by a common culture. Celtic language, Druids as religious leaders, a world full of myths and rituals. There was strength in this diversity, but also weakness. For when Rome under Julius Caesar turned its eyes on Gaul, the fragmentation proved disastrous. Julius Caesar and the Conquest. It was the year 58 BC when Julius Caesar, Roman general and politician, began the Gallic War. What began as a campaign to secure Roman borders became an unprecedented conquest. For 7 years, legions fought against Gallic tribes, and Caesar wrote down his deeds in the famous Commentarii de Bello Gallico. In these accounts, Gaul appears like a stage on which Caesar could shine. The battles, the victories, the diplomatic intrigues. But behind the sober words was a brutal war. Entire villages were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands fell or were enslaved. The resistance of the Gallic leader Vercingetorix became famous. A young prince of the Arverni who united the Gallic tribes under one banner in 52 BC, at least for a short time. His uprising was an act of desperate unity. The climax was the siege of Alesia, where Vercingetorix and his warriors defied the Roman siege rings. But Caesar showed his genius. Double ramparts, ditches, traps. The Gauls were surrounded. Hunger and exhaustion forced them to surrender. Vercingetorix surrendered, handed over his weapons to Caesar, and was later executed in Rome. With him died the dream of an independent Gaul. Gaul as part of the Roman Empire. After the defeat, a new era began. Gaul became a Roman province, and slowly Roman culture permeated all areas of life. Cities were built according to the Roman model, with forums, thermal baths, amphitheaters. Roads connected the provinces with Rome. Aqueducts brought water. Latin gradually replaced the Celtic language. But this Romanization was not a pure dictate. It was also an exchange. Gauls served in Roman legions. Merchants brought wine and oil from Italy, while Gauls supplied grain and slaves. Some tribes profited, became part of the Roman elite, and received civil rights. Southern Gaul in particular, the Provincia Narbonensis, quickly became the Roman heartland. Trade flourished here. Arles stood here with its amphitheater, and magnificent villas were built here. In the north and west, things went slower, but even there, Roman and Celtic traditions merged. The birth of a new identity. Roman rule lasted for centuries, and it was during this time that something began that laid the foundation for what would later become France. A new identity emerged from Celtic tribes and Roman culture, Gallo-Roman. This mixed culture was more than just a coexistence. The Gauls adopted Latin names, Roman law, and Roman religion, but they also retained their peculiarities. Druids disappeared, but rural customs remained. When Christianity finally took root in Gaul, first persecuted, later recognized, it allied itself with this Gallo-Roman world. Cities like Lyon became centers of faith. Missionaries spread the new religion, and martyrs like Saint Denis became symbolic figures. The beginning of the end. But the Roman Empire was not eternal. From the 3rd century onwards, Gaul came under increasing danger. Germanic tribes such as the Franks, Alemanni, or Vandals crossed the Rhine, plundered cities, and settled. Rome, weakened by internal crises, could no longer protect the province. In the 5th century, fate was sealed. In 476, the Western Roman Empire fell, and new masters rose up in Gaul, the Franks. With them, a new era began, but the Roman heritage remained in language, culture, religion. Latin was to become the basis of France. Roman law shaped institutions. And the dream of a strong, united order reverberated from Caesar to Charlemagne. Chapter 3: Franks and the Merovingians. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the West, Gaul was left like a land without solid ground. Cities that had once been protected by legions suddenly stood alone. Roads fell apart, trade routes broke down, and Germanic tribes streamed across the Rhine. Among them were the Franks, a people who were initially little more than a loose association of small groups of warriors, but who were soon to lay the foundation for a new empire. The Franks originally settled on the Lower Rhine, but in the course of the 5th century, they penetrated deeper into Gaul. They differed from other peoples in that they not only wanted to plunder, but also settled, cultivated fields, and gradually mixed with the Gallo-Roman population. In this combination of Germanic courage and Roman heritage, something new emerged, the Frankish Empire. The decisive step to power came with Clovis I. He was a young, ambitious king from the Merovingian dynasty, which supposedly derived its name from a legendary ancestor named Merovech. Clovis realized that he needed more than military victories. He had to gain legitimacy, not only among his Frankish warriors, but also among the Gallo-Roman elites, who still had great influence. The decisive moment came around the year 500 when Clovis was baptized. His wife, Chrodochilde, a Burgundian princess, had convinced him of Christianity. The baptism in Reims, presided over by Bishop Remigius, was more than a religious act. It was a political masterpiece. While other Germanic rulers embraced Arianism, Clovis professed Roman Catholicism. In doing so, he sided with the Gallo-Roman Church and won its support. From then on, the story picked up speed. Clovis expanded his empire with iron severity, defeating the Alemanni, the Visigoths, and rival Frankish kings. His empire soon stretched from the Pyrenees to the Rhine. He moved his capital to Paris, which this became the heart of Frankish power. Paris, once just a Gallo-Roman provincial city, began its rise to become the political and symbolic metropolis of France. After Clovis died in 511, the empire was divided among his sons, a tradition that brought much blood and chaos. But the idea of a united Frankish empire remained, even if the Merovingians often provided weak rulers. In the centuries after Clovis, the picture changed. While the kings degenerated more and more into shadow figures, other men gained influence. It was the Hausmeier, originally only administrators of the royal household, who exercised true power over time. The Merovingian kings were later referred to as lazy kings because they had golden hair and shining thrones but little authority of their own. They rode through the country in magnificent wagons, while their householders fought battles, collected taxes, and made politics. The most famous of these householders was Pippin the Middle, followed by his son Charles Martel. The latter became famous because he stopped the expansion of the Arabs from Spain at Tours and Poitiers in 732, a victory that was glorified in the chronicles as the salvation of the Christian West. In doing so, Charles Martel prepared the ground for the rise of a new dynasty. The Merovingian householders became the Carolingians, named after Charles himself. His grandson was to lead the Frankish Empire to unprecedented heights, Charlemagne. But before he took over the crown, it was Clovis who had laid the foundation with his baptism and his conquests. With him, the history of the French monarchy began, and the myth that France was the eldest daughter of the Church. Chapter 4. Charlemagne and the Carolingian Empire. If you look at the beginnings of the Middle Ages, a figure like a giant stands out from the mists of history, Charlemagne. Its name alone evokes images of knights, churches, crowns, and an empire that seemed to encompass all of Europe. He was not only a king of the Franks, but also the first ruler to restore a European order after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And yet his legacy was as torn as it was brilliant. Charlemagne, born around 747, was the son of Pippin the Younger, the first king of the new Carolingian dynasty. When Pippin died in 768, Charles and his brother Carloman divided the empire. But after a few years, Carloman died, and so Charles became the sole ruler. From then on, a life began that was marked by countless wars, alliances, and reforms. Charles's power did not grow overnight, but through constant expansion. Against the Lombards in Italy, whom he defeated and whose kingdom he subjugated. Against the Saxons, whom he fought for decades and forcibly forced to convert to Christianity. Against Arabs in Spain, against Avars in the East. Everywhere his campaigns led to an expansion of his empire. Soon it stretched from the North Sea to the Pyrenees, from the Atlantic to deep into Central Europe. No empire since antiquity had had such a scope. But Charles was not only a conqueror. He understood that power could not be secured with the sword alone. That is why he created an administration that was revolutionary for its time. He sent counts to the provinces to administer justice and collect taxes, and sent his missi dominici, royal envoys, through the empire to check whether the orders were carried out. This created a network of royal authority that extended across the vast territories. Charles's relationship to the church was even more important. For him, Christianity was not just a religion, but a bond that held his kingdom together. He promoted monasteries, founded bishoprics, and brought scholars such as Alcuin from England to his court. These reforms gave rise to the so-called Carolingian Renaissance. Schools were established, manuscripts were copied, and knowledge of antiquity was preserved. For the first time in centuries, education flourished again, albeit still limited to elite circles. The climax of Charlemagne's life came at Christmas in the year 800. In Rome, in St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo III put the crown on him and proclaimed him Roman Emperor. With this act, Charles became the successor of the ancient Caesars, at least in symbol. It was a rebirth of the empire, a signal that Europe once again had an order reminiscent of Rome. The emperor was not only a secular ruler, but also a defender of the church, the guarantor of Christianity. But behind the splendor there was also toughness. Charlemagne's empire was characterized by constant wars, by forced missions, by cruelty against insurgents. Above all, the war against the Saxons was a bloody chapter. Entire villages were destroyed, tens of thousands were forcibly baptized, resistance was broken with massacres. The unity of his empire was a work of violence as well as of culture. When Charles died in Aachen in 814, he left behind an empire that was larger than anything Europe had seen since antiquity. But it was an empire that was difficult to hold. His sons and grandsons were already fighting over the succession, and with the division of Verdun in 843, the work fell apart. France and Germany emerged from this legacy as separate states, and the dream of a unified Europe was shattered again. Nevertheless, Karl's shine remained unbroken. Centuries later, he was invoked as the father of Europe. Holy Roman emperors invoked him, and France also considered him part of its origins. He still rests in Aachen today, and his name lives on, not only in chronicles, but also in the myths of a continent. Chapter 5. The Middle Ages: Knights, Castles, and Cathedrals. After the death of Charlemagne and the division of his empire, a long epoch began for France, which we know today as the Middle Ages. It was a time marked by contrasts, violence and insecurity, as well as faith, beauty, and cultural flourishing. In the 9th and 10th centuries, France was not a fixed state, but a land of castles, monasteries, and markets, in which kings often had less power than their powerful dukes and counts. And yet it was also the time when the foundations of the French nation were formed. The division of Verdun in 843 had cut up the Carolingian Empire. The western part developed into what we now call France. But the first centuries were marked by weakness. Norman Vikings sailed up the rivers, plundered Paris and many cities. In the south, Saracens besieged the coasts. In the east, Hungarians pushed into the country. The king in Paris had difficulty intervening. The country was too large, the central power too weak. In this world, the local princes gained power. They built castles on hills, surrounded by walls and moats from which they defended their territories. Feudal society emerged. The king lent land to his vassals, who swore allegiance and provided knights in return. These knights were not only warriors, but also a class with its own ideals: courage, honor, loyalty, the protection of the church and the weak. This is how the image of the noble knight was created, which still shapes the idea of the Middle Ages today, even if the reality was often more brutal. While castles ruled the country, cathedrals rose in the cities and villages. From the 12th century onwards, the great age of the Gothic began. In Chartres, Reims, Amiens, and Paris, buildings grew into the sky whose pointed towers and stained glass windows were not only an expression of faith, but also of power and community. Entire generations worked on these cathedrals, which became symbols of medieval France. They showed that despite the political fragmentation, there was a common spirit, that of Christianity, which determined the lives of all. The Middle Ages were also the time of the Crusades, in which France played a decisive role. From Clermont, where Pope Urban II proclaimed the First Crusade in 1095, to the great armies of knights who marched to Jerusalem, French knights were among the driving forces behind these undertakings. They brought glory but also suffering to the countries they conquered. At the same time, the Crusades opened France to the outside world, bringing new ideas, spices, knowledge, and art from the Orient. But it was not only knights and churches that determined the country. The peasants, the vast majority of the population, also shaped medieval France. They worked in the fields, paid taxes to their masters, and lived a hard life, depending on harvests and weather. Their efforts made the splendor of the castles and cathedrals possible. Slowly but surely, the King of Paris began to regain more power. From the 10th century onwards, the Capetian dynasty ruled, which began with Hugo Capet. At first, their dominion was small, little more than the area around Paris. But generation after generation, they expanded their influence through marriages, wars, and clever politics. France began to form into a kingdom that was more than a patchwork of principalities. Thus, the Middle Ages were an era of uncertainty and construction, of faith and violence. France slowly found its way out of the turmoil of the early Middle Ages and laid the foundation for the power it was to develop in the centuries to come. The castles on the hills, the cathedrals with their stained glass windows, and the knights with their oaths were the expression of a world that seems foreign to us today, but which is the roots of many of France's traditions. Chapter 6. The Capetians and the Building of a Strong Monarchy. When Hugo Capet was elected king in Noyon in 987, no one could have guessed that he would mark the beginning of a dynasty that would shape France for centuries. In truth, he was little more than a local prince at the time, whose power was limited to the Île-de-France, i.e., the area around Paris. The great dukes and counts, the dukes of Normandy, the counts of Anjou, or the lords of Aquitaine were far superior to him in wealth and influence. But it was precisely in this modest position that the strength of the Capetians lay. They ruled continuously for generations, using clever marriages, clever politics, and a long tradition to form a powerful kingdom from a small heartland. The Capetians knew how to secure their rule by having their sons installed as co-kings during their lifetime. In this way, the succession was secured and the throne remained in the family without interruption for centuries. At a time when many kingdoms were falling apart due to succession crises, this stability was a decisive advantage. Step by step, they expanded their power, at first slowly but inexorably. Especially in the 12th and 13th centuries, the monarchy experienced a great boom. Under Philip II Augustus, the monarchy became really strong for the first time. He defeated the English King John of England and regained large parts of Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine for the French crown. In doing so, he broke English supremacy on the continent and laid the foundation for what would later become France. Under his rule, Paris became a political and cultural center. The University of Paris achieved world fame, and the city grew into a metropolis of the Middle Ages. His successor, Louis IX, better known as Saint Louis, embodied the splendor of this era. He was not only a king, but also a deeply religious man who led 2 crusades and was even canonized after his death. Under him, the monarchy experienced a moral authority that radiated far beyond France. Louis IX was considered the just ruler who held court under an oak tree and shaped the image of the king as the father of his subjects. France was also strengthened internally under the Capetians. The law became more systematic, royal officials supervised the provinces, and royalty began to break the power of the feudal lords. While the castles of the dukes and counts slowly lost their importance, the king's authority grew. The French monarch became the center of a state that grew ever closer together. At the same time, culture flourished. The Gothic cathedrals that we still admire today were built during this time. Chartres, Reims, Amiens, they were not only buildings of faith, but also an expression of a society that developed self-confidence. The French language began to assert itself as a written language, and courtly literature, the stories of knights and noble love, found its origins in France. Of course, this time was not free of conflicts. Tensions with England, which controlled large parts of France, remained and would later escalate in the Hundred Years' War. Internal struggles with powerful noble families or uprisings of the peasants were also part of reality. But overall, it was the era in which a small kingdom in the heart of Gaul became an empire that gradually claimed to be the leading power in Europe. The Capetians had created a foundation that was to last for centuries. The uncertainty of the early Middle Ages gave rise to a monarchy that gradually shaped the face of France. And while Paris, with its cathedrals and universities, became the shining capital, the country was preparing for a time that was to be marked by wars and crises, as well as by national awakening, the Hundred Years' War, in which France had to assert its fate against England. Chapter 7: Hundred Years' War and Joan of Arc. No sooner had the French monarchy developed its strength under the Capetians than it got into one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts in European history, the Hundred Years' War. This name is deceptive because it was not a single war but a whole chain of conflicts, battles, and truces which stretched from 1337 to 1453. For more than a century, France and England faced each other, and this struggle was not only about crowns and territories, but also about the question of what it meant to be French or English. The origin of the conflict lay in a complicated interweaving of dynasties. When the French king Charles IV died without a male heir in 1328, the English king Edward III laid claim to the French crown because his mother was a sister of the deceased king. But the French princes decided otherwise. They recognized Philip VI of Valois as the new king. This began a dispute over the succession to the throne and fiefdom, which soon escalated into a war. The first decades of the war were devastating for France. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 showed the military superiority of the English, who defeated the French army of knights with their longbowmen. 10 years later, in 1356, the drama was repeated at the Battle of Poitiers, where even the French king John II was taken prisoner by the English. France was humiliated, the coffers empty, the country devastated by mercenary armies and plundering. As if this were not enough, the plague broke out over Europe. The Black Death depopulated entire regions, and millions also died in France. Villages were abandoned, fields lay fallow, and people lived in constant fear of disease, hunger, and violence. In this atmosphere of distress and despair, the French crown seemed to lose its luster. But France did not give up. Under Charles V, the so-called sage, the country recovered. He skillfully avoided open battles, relied on sieges and patience, and was thus able to regain large parts of the country. But after his death, everything began to falter again. The nobility was divided. Civil wars such as the one between Armagnacs and Bourguignons weakened the country, and England seized the opportunity. The low point came in 1415, when the French suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Azincourt. Once again, the English archers defeated the proud French knights, and the country descended into chaos. A few years later, the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 even recognized the English King Henry V as heir to the French crown. But in this darkest hour, a figure appeared who is still one of the greatest symbols of France today, Joan of Arc. A simple peasant girl from Domremy who claimed to be guided by heavenly voices that commanded her to save France. With incredible courage and deep religious conviction, she appeared before the Dauphin, Charles, the later Charles VII, in 1429 and convinced him to entrust her with an army. What happened next was like a miracle. Joan led the French troops to Orleans, which was besieged by the English. Their demeanor, their determination, and their faith gave the soldiers new strength. The siege was broken, and France felt hope for the first time in decades. A little later, Joan accompanied Charles to Reims, where he had himself crowned king, an act of tremendous symbolic power that renewed the French monarchy. But Johanna's path was short and tragic. In 1430, she was captured by Burgundian allies of the English, handed over to the English, and tried in Rouen. They were accused of heresy, sorcery, and treason.
In truth, she was a threat to English claims. On May 30, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in Rouen. She died at the age of only 19, but her martyrdom made her immortal. The war continued for another 2 decades, but France had risen again. Under Charles VII and later Louis XI, the English were pushed back step by step. In 1453, the war ended with the Battle of Castillon, in which the French finally defeated the English. Only Calais remained in English hands. France was destroyed, but it was free, and a new identity had been formed from the long struggle. The 100 Years' War had changed the image of France forever. People began to see themselves not only as subjects of individual dukes or counts, but as part of a nation. Joan of Arc became a national hero, a symbol of faith and determination. The war had devastated France, but it had also united it. And he had shown that even in the greatest need, new strength could grow out of courage and hope.
Chapter 8. Renaissance in France. With the end of the 100 Years' War, France began a phase of recovery and reconstruction. The fields, which had been devastated for decades, were cultivated again. The cities rose from ruins. Trade and crafts revived. But it was not only a time of material recovery, but also a spiritual turning point. The Renaissance, which had its origins in Italy, reached France and profoundly changed culture, art, and society. The term Renaissance means rebirth, and indeed it was a rediscovery of antiquity, its art, its philosophy, and its science. French kings and nobles traveled to Italy, saw the magnificent palaces of Florence, Leonardo's paintings, and the writings of the humanists. They brought artists, architects, and scholars to France, and gradually a new era began north of the Alps. Especially under Francis I, who reigned from 1515 to 1547, the Renaissance in France reached its peak. France was a king of great ambition and a hunger for education. He saw himself as a patron of the arts and science. Under his rule, magnificent castles were built on the Loire, such as Chambord and Chenonceau, which breathed the spirit of the new era with their towers, gables, and wide parks. Francis brought artists such as Leonardo da Vinci to his court, who spent his last years in Amboise and died there. But the Renaissance was more than just a game of princes. It changed society because new ideas challenged the old structures. Humanists such as Guillaume Boudet and François Rabelais wrote about the value of education, freedom of thought, and human dignity. Books became more easily accessible through the printing press, and knowledge spread more quickly. The University of Paris remained a center of learning, but new currents opposed the old ecclesiastical thinking. With the Renaissance, France's self-confidence as a European power also grew. Francis I waged wars against the House of Habsburg, which ruled Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. In Italy, he tried to gain influence, but often with varying luck. The rivalry with Charles V, the most powerful ruler of his time, determined European politics for decades. France presented itself as a counterweight to the Habsburg power, a claim that was to accompany the country for centuries to come. But in the splendor of that time, a shadow was already looming. With the Reformation, which was triggered by Martin Luther in Germany, religious tensions also began in France. More and more people turned to the new teachings that demanded a renewal of the church. They were called Huguenots, and soon France was faced with deep internal conflicts that were to escalate into the wars of religion. The Renaissance in France was thus an epoch full of contrasts. On the one hand, beauty, art, science, and intellectual freedom. On the other hand, the first cracks in the religious and social order. It made France a center of European culture, a land of castles, poets, and artists. But it also prepared the ground for the conflicts that were to shake the 16th century. Chapter 9. Wars of Religion and St. Bartholomew's Day. The Renaissance had allowed France to flourish, but at the same time, it had awakened new tensions. With the Reformation, ideas of faith renewal and personal understanding of the Bible also spread to French soil. More and more people, especially in the cities and among the educated classes, turned to the teachings of Calvin and Luther. They were called Huguenots, and soon they were in open opposition to the Catholic majority. What began as a religious question quickly developed into a political conflict that would tear France apart for decades. The French kings were hostile to the new teachings. Francis I, and even more so his son Henry II, had Protestants persecuted and executions carried out in order to preserve the unity of the Church. But the number of Huguenots continued to grow, and they found powerful supporters among influential noble families, such as the Bourbons. This made the movement not only a religious current, but also a political force that shook the state. After the death of Henry II in 1559, the monarchy fell into crisis. His sons were young and weak. The regent Catherine de' Medici tried to keep the balance, but the tensions between Catholic and Huguenot noble families erupted into violence. Thus, in 1562, the first of the so-called religious wars began with the massacre of Wassy. For decades, sieges, battles, and peace treaties alternated that never lasted long. The night of 23 to 24 August 1572, St. Bartholomew's Night, was particularly bloody and notorious. In Paris, numerous Huguenot nobles had gathered to attend the wedding of Henry of Navarre, a Bourbon and leader of the Huguenots, to Margaret of Valois, the king's sister. This marriage was to be a symbol of reconciliation between the denominations. But that night, the mood changed. On the orders of the Queen Mother Catherine de' Medici, or at least with her approval, Catholic militias began to slaughter the Huguenots in their accommodations. The bloodbath spread like wildfire, not only in Paris, but also in many other cities. Thousands of Protestants were murdered, and trust between the denominations was finally destroyed. France sank into civil war again. Entire regions were under the control of one side or the other. The country was torn apart, and the crown continued to lose authority. It was not until Henry of Navarre, later Henry IV, that a turning point came. He was a Huguenot himself, but professed Catholicism out of political wisdom, with the famous words that Paris was worth a mass. In 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes, which guaranteed the Huguenots far-reaching rights and put an end to the wars of religion. This began a phase of calming, but the wounds were deep. France had been marked by hatred and violence for decades. Neighbors had beaten each other to death. Families had been torn apart. At the same time, it had become clear that the religious unity that had characterized the Middle Ages had been irretrievably lost. France had entered the modern era, in which questions of faith were inseparable from power and politics. St. Bartholomew's Day remained in the collective memory as a symbol of cruelty and fanaticism. It showed how deep the rifts in society were, and at the same time, it made clear how difficult it would be to unite a country torn between faith and power. But Henry IV also marked the beginning of a new chapter, the age of absolutism, which was to lead France to unprecedented power and splendor. Chapter 10: The Age of Absolutism. Louis XIV and Versailles. With the end of the wars of religion and the reign of Henry IV, a certain stability returned to France. His Edict of Nantes had brought peace to the country, and his son Louis XIII began to consolidate the power of royalty. Under the leadership of its great minister, Cardinal Richelieu, France was gradually transformed into a monarchy, in which the king and his officials gained the upper hand over nobles and estates. But all this was only a prelude to the epoch that still shapes the image of France today, the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Louis XIV ascended the throne in 1643 as a child. Initially, his mother Anne of Austria ruled together with Cardinal Mazarin, but at a young age, Louis experienced the dangers of uprisings and civil wars, which became known as Fronde. These riots, which were directed against the royal power and against Mazarin's policies, had a profound impact on the young king.
He swore never again to allow the weakness of royalty, and when he took full power, he made his claim unmistakably clear: I am the state. Under Louis XIV, absolutism reached its perfection in France. The king placed himself at the center of all political, social, and cultural events. He ruled without the Estates General, relied on an army of officials who were directly dependent on him, and he controlled the nobility and the church with an iron fist. In order to keep the great noble families away from power, he invited them to his court, where he tied them up with etiquette, ceremonial, and splendor. The symbol of this rule was Versailles. Originally a hunting lodge, Ludwig had it expanded into one of the largest palaces in the world. Miles of gardens, magnificent halls, the famous Hall of Mirrors, Versailles was not only a residence but a stage of power. Every step, every gesture of the king became a spectacle that staged the superiority of the ruler. Versailles was the place where the nobility spent themselves in courtly splendor and at the same time lost their political independence. But the glamour also had its downsides. In order to secure his power and make France the leading power in Europe, Louis XIV waged wars almost continuously. His armies marched against the Habsburgs, against the Netherlands, against Spain. Sometimes it brought victories in new territories, sometimes the campaigns ended in bloody exhaustion. France became a major military power, but the burden of the wars also grew. Taxes rose, farmers suffered, the country was exhausted. Ludwig was also intransigent in religious terms. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had protected his Protestant subjects. Thousands of Huguenots fled the country, many of them highly educated and wealthy. France lost not only people, but also economic strength as a result. But for Louis, religious unity was more important than tolerance, an expression of his idea that only the king could order the empire. Culturally, however, France experienced a blossoming that still shines today. Poets such as Molière and Racine, musicians such as Lully, architects and painters shaped the era. The court of Versailles became the benchmark for the whole of Europe. Language, fashion, and art from France were everywhere imitated, and French developed into the European diplomatic language. When Louis XIV died in 1715, after more than 70 years on the throne, France was at the height of its power and splendor on the one hand, but on the other marked by wars and financial burdens. The image of the Sun King, however, remained unforgotten, a king who put himself at the center and who embodied the idea of absolutism so perfectly that his empire is still associated with splendor, austerity, and glory today.
Chapter 11. Enlightenment and Social Tensions. After the death of Louis XIV in 1715, France entered a new era. The Sun King had wrapped the country in splendor, but also left it exhausted. His long wars and the pompous court had ruined the state finances. His great-grandson, Louis XV, was still a child when he ascended the throne. The first years were under the reign of the Duke of Orléans, and it soon became apparent that the age of unlimited absolutism was beginning to crack. At the beginning of the 18th century, French society was divided into three estates. The clergy formed the first, the nobility the second, and all the others, from the rich citizen to the poor peasant, belonged to the third estate. This order was deeply rooted, but it was also unjust. While the nobility and clergy enjoyed many privileges and paid hardly any taxes, the third estate bore the burden of the state. Farmers had to pay taxes, citizens were oppressed by taxes, while the rich lived at court in Paris or in their castles. At the same time, a movement began that fundamentally challenged this order, the Enlightenment. Philosophers, writers, and scholars demanded the renewal of society with pen and book. Montesquieu wrote about the separation of powers and the need to limit power. Voltaire fought with biting derision against fanaticism and for religious tolerance. Rousseau developed the idea of the social contract, according to which true authority emanates from the people and not from a king.
Diderot and D'Alembert collected the knowledge of their time in the Encyclopédie, a monumental work that claimed to explain the world in a rational form. These ideas spread throughout Europe, but in France they had a particularly explosive power, because here they met a society that rigidly clung to privileges and closed its eyes to the plight of the majority. While aristocrats and citizens discussed new ideas in the Parisian salons, the peasants in the countryside starved. Again and again, crop failures led to hunger crises, and the price of bread rose. The monarchy also lost its reputation. Louis XV reigned for a long time, but he seemed weak and overshadowed by scandals. "After us, the deluge," he is said to have said, an expression of the indifference he was said to have. His successor, Louis XVI, who came to the throne in 1774, was good-natured and conscientious, but insecure. He wanted reforms, but he failed again and again due to the resistance of the nobility and church privileges. France found itself in a dangerous situation. The state coffers were empty because wars and courting had left the country in debt. At the same time, people's awareness had grown. The ideas of the Enlightenment could no longer be suppressed. They were disseminated in pamphlets, in plays, and in discussions. There was talk of freedom, equality, and the right of the people to decide for themselves. When France finally intervened in the American War of Independence to weaken England, it brought prestige, but finally ruined the finances. Paradoxically, the ideas of the Revolution returned from America to France, the demand for freedom and self-determination. So a tension grew that became more and more unbearable. A king that could not push through reforms, a nobility that defended its privileges, a clergy that insisted on its special rights, and a third estate that increasingly recognized its injustice. This mixture was explosive. At the end of the 18th century, France was at a crossroads. Versailles still shone in golden splendor. The kings still held their court ceremonies. Society still submitted to the old rules. But things were fermenting under the surface. The Enlightenment had changed thinking, and the injustices of society had shaken the foundation of absolutism. Soon, the revolution would break out that would change France and the world forever.
Chapter 12. The French Revolution, 1789 to 1799. In the summer of 1789, France rose up against its own order. The tensions that had built up over decades broke through and plunged the country into a revolution that would change not only France, but the whole world. No other epoch has shaped the image of France as strongly as those years between 1789 and 1799, in which kings were overthrown, rights were declared, republics were founded, and heads were rolled. The beginning was still inconspicuous, at least compared to what was to follow. Louis XVI, plagued by debts and attempts at reform that had failed due to resistance from the estates, convened the Estates General in May 1789. An assembly of the three estates that had not met for more than 150 years. New taxes were to be decided here, but instead the representatives of the third estate raised their voices. They declared that they no longer represented the interests of only one social class, but the entire people. This is how the National Assembly came into being. On July 14, 1789, the first thunderclap fell in Paris, the storming of the Bastille. The fortress was little more than a prison, but it was a symbol of royal despotism. Her fall became the beacon that ignited the revolution. Soon the uprising flared up all over the country. Peasants stormed aristocratic castles, burned documents about taxes, cities organized their own administration. In the Night of Miracles on August 4, the National Assembly abolished feudal rights, and shortly afterwards it adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which elevated liberty, equality, and fraternity to the principles of society. But the path to the new order was full of conflicts. The monarchy initially remained in place, but it was limited by a constitution. Louis XVI, however, could not resign himself to this role.
His escape attempt in 1791, which failed at Varennes, made him a symbol of betrayal. More and more French people wondered whether a king still had a place in the new order. The situation came to a head when foreign powers intervened. Austria and Prussia feared that the revolution could also affect their countries and declared war on France. The threat from outside intensified radicalization at home. In Paris, the will of the people increasingly took over the streets. The sans-culottes, simple citizens with red Jacobin caps, demanded the abolition of the monarchy. On September 21, 1792, the Republic was proclaimed. The king himself was now declared an enemy. A trial sentenced Louis XVI to death, and on January 21, 1793, the guillotine fell on the Place de la Révolution. A year later, his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, was also affected. With these executions, the Ancien regime was finally eliminated. But the price was high. France sank into the maelstrom of violence. The revolution entered its most radical phase, the Reign of Terror. Under the leadership of Robespierre and the Jacobins, the Republic was secured with an iron fist. Anyone suspected of opposing the revolution fell victim to the revolutionary court. The guillotine worked tirelessly, and even former revolutionaries fell victim to it. At the same time, society was reorganized. A new calendar was introduced, the church was disempowered, society was to become pure and virtuous. But terror cannot be the foundation of a lasting order. In 1794, Robespierre himself was overthrown and executed. A new phase began, which was more moderate but unstable. The council, known as the Directory, ruled, but it was marked by corruption and incompetence. The people were dissatisfied, the economy weak, the wars against the European powers continued. During this time, a young general came to the fore, whose name would soon dominate all of Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. His victories in Italy and Egypt made him a folk hero. In 1799, he took advantage of the weakness of the Directory and grabbed power. With a coup d'état on the 18th Brumaire, he deposed the government and took over the leadership himself. This ended the revolution as it had begun, with a coup. The hope of freedom, equality, and fraternity had turned into a turbulent decade that had devastated France, but also renewed it. The revolution had overthrown the old order, proclaimed the rights of man, and created the idea of a nation. But it had also shown how thin the line is between freedom and violence, between utopia and terror. In the end, France was ready for a new chapter that was to become even more powerful and dramatic, the Age of Napoleon.
Chapter 13. Napoleon Bonaparte, Rise, Glory, and Fall. When the revolution was exhausted and the Directory hardly enjoyed the trust of the people, a man who was to shape France and Europe forever stepped onto the stage of history, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was not a king by birth, but a Corsican outsider who, through talent, ambition, and unwavering will, rose to become the most powerful ruler of his time. His story is one of the most dazzling dramas of ascension in world history. Napoleon was born in Corsica in 1769, shortly after the island was annexed by France. From an early age, he showed extraordinary talent in mathematics and the art of war. He attended military schools in France and joined the army, where he initially attracted little attention. But the revolution offered opportunities for ambitious men, and Napoleon took advantage of them. His first great triumph was the recapture of Toulon in 1793, where he repelled the British besiegers as a young artillery officer. Soon, he was considered a genius. The real breakthrough came in 1796 when he was given command of the army in Italy. With astonishing energy, he led his troops from victory to victory, defeating the Austrians and bringing France's influence in northern Italy to a climax. His campaigns were not only militarily successful, they also made him a national hero. Napoleon knew how to stage victories, present himself as the savior of the nation, and bind his soldiers to him. In 1799, when the Directory in Paris faltered, Napoleon returned from an adventurous, albeit ultimately unsuccessful, Egyptian campaign. He took advantage of the political crisis to seize power through a coup d'état. With the 18th Brumaire, the consulate began, in which he first ruled as first consul, a little later as consul for life. Even here, he showed that he wanted to be much more than a military hero. He rebuilt the state, centralized the administration, reformed the law with the famous Code Civil, and thus created foundations that still have an effect in France today. But Napoleon's ambition knew no bounds. In 1804, he had himself crowned emperor in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, an act that symbolically took the crown not from the hands of the Pope, but from his own. France was once again an empire, and Napoleon was at its head, not as the heir to an ancient dynasty, but as a man who had created himself. In the following years, he ruled Europe. With lightning-fast campaigns, he defeated coalitions of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. The Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, the Battle of the Three Emperors, made him the undisputed ruler of the continent. He placed brothers and relatives on European thrones, from Naples to Spain, and formed an empire that stretched from Portugal to Poland. But in its splendor lay its downfall. The war in Spain developed into a bloody partisan struggle that wore down Napoleon's army. The attempt to defeat Great Britain economically by means of a continental blockade failed. The decisive blow came in 1812, when he moved to Russia with a huge army. Initially victorious, the campaign turned into a disaster. Burning Moscow, the harsh winter, hunger, and disease destroyed his army. Of over 600,000 soldiers, only a few tens of thousands returned. Europe rose up against him. He suffered a heavy defeat in the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, and in 1814 the Allies entered Paris. Napoleon was forced to abdicate and sent into exile on the island of Elba. But his ambition did not let him rest. In the spring of 1815 he returned, landed in the south of France, and marched on Paris. Without a shot, he became ruler again. The reign of the 100 Days began. His last chapter was Waterloo. On June 18, 1815, he met the combined troops of the British and Prussians. Once again he showed his genius, but fate was against him. The defeat sealed his end. This time he was sent far away, to the remote island of St. Helena in the Atlantic. There he spent his last years, wrote his memoirs, and pondered his life until he died in 1821. Napoleon left behind an ambivalent legacy. He had covered Europe with wars, cost millions of lives, and shook old monarchies. But he had also created order, left behind laws, modernized administration, and spread ideas that had an impact far beyond his time. For some, he was a tyrant, for others, a hero. In any case, he was a figure who elevated France to a world power and whose shadow continued to have an effect for a long time. Chapter 14: France in the 19th Century: Restoration, Revolutions, and the Empire. After the fall of Napoleon in 1815, France faced an uncertain future. Europe had defeated the emperor and wanted to create order. At the Congress of Vienna, the victorious powers restored the old monarchy. The Bourbons, who had once been overthrown by the Revolution, returned to the throne. Louis XVIII, the brother of the executed Louis XVI, took over the crown and promised a constitutional monarchy that would mediate between tradition and modernity. But mistrust remained great. The time of the Restoration was marked by contradictions. On the one hand, the kings tried to build on the old order, but on the other hand, they could no longer completely reverse the achievements of the Revolution. The Code Civil remained. The idea of civil rights could no longer be extinguished. France vacillated between the desire for stability and the urge for change. After Louis XVIII, his brother Charles X, a staunch representative of the old monarchy, ascended the throne. He tried to restore the privileges of the nobility and the church, but he met with resistance. In 1830, the discontent erupted in a revolution.
Barricades were erected in Paris, workers and citizens fought for freedom, and Charles X had to abdicate. He was replaced by Louis Philippe, the Citizen King. Louis Philippe presented himself as the monarch of the people, dispensed with royal symbols, and sought proximity to the bourgeoisie. But his reign was also marked by tensions. Industrialization began, factories were built, railways were built, and with them social antagonisms grew. Workers lived in poverty, while entrepreneurs and banks became rich. Again and again there were protests, and the people demanded more say. In 1848, the revolution finally broke out again. In Paris, the insurgents overthrew the monarchy and proclaimed the Second Republic. For the first time, universal male suffrage was introduced, and it seemed that France had found a new democratic future. But the euphoria did not last long. The economic crisis and social conflicts divided the young republic. In this climate, a new man emerged, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of Napoleon I. With the famous name behind him, he won the presidential election in 1848. Soon, however, his ambition became apparent. In 1851, he staged a coup, and a year later he crowned himself Emperor Napoleon III. Under Napoleon III, France experienced a phase of change. Paris was rebuilt by Baron Haussmann. Wide boulevards, magnificent squares, and modern infrastructure gave the city its current appearance. Railways connected the country, trade and industry flourished, and France presented itself as a modern great power. But the shiny facade could not conceal the weaknesses. In foreign policy, Napoleon III sought glory, but his wars had mixed results. The Crimean War brought prestige, the war in Mexico ended in disaster. However, the conflict with Prussia weighed most heavily. In 1870, the Franco-German War broke out, and France suffered a crushing defeat. The Battle of Sedan sealed the fate of Napoleon III, who was captured. In Paris, the Third Republic was proclaimed. France had thus once again entered a new era. The 19th century had produced 3 monarchies, 2 republics, and an empire for the country. It was a century of constant upheavals in which the people repeatedly took to the streets to fight for freedom and co-determination. But it was also a century of progress, industrialization, cities, and bourgeois self-confidence. France was a different country at the end of the century than it was at the beginning. The revolutions had strengthened faith in the rights of the people. Industrialization had transformed society and the economy. And political experiments had shown how difficult it was to combine tradition and modernity. But now France was faced with new challenges because the defeat against Germany in 1871 was to leave deep wounds and shape the Republic. Chapter 15. The Franco-German War of 1870–71 and the Third Republic. When France went to war against Prussia in 1870, it was convinced that it would have an easy time with its army and its emperor Napoleon III at the head. They wanted to defend the honor of France, which had been insulted by diplomatic tensions. But what was intended as a short campaign developed into one of the greatest catastrophes in French history. The causes lay in a diplomatic dispute over the succession to the Spanish throne, but in reality it was a power struggle between France and the aspiring Prussia. Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian prime minister, cleverly provoked the war he needed to unite the German states behind him. France declared war on July 19, 1870, and thus fell into the trap. It soon became apparent that the French army was ill prepared. While Prussia and its allies used modern organization, rail transport, and precise artillery, France suffered from outdated structures. The defeats piled up, and the decisive blow came on September 2, 1870, in the Battle of Sedan. Napoleon III was surrounded there with his entire army and forced to capitulate. France's emperor was trapped. The empire collapsed. In Paris, the people reacted with anger and despair. On September 4, 1870, the Third Republic was proclaimed. But the new rulers were faced with an almost hopeless situation. The German troops were advancing inexorably. Paris was besieged. The capital spent the winter of 1870-71 in hunger, in the cold, and under constant shelling. The proud city held out, but in the end, France had to capitulate. The Peace of Frankfurt in May 1871 was hard and humiliating. France lost Alsace and Lorraine to the newly founded German Empire, which was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, a blow to the heart of French honor. In addition, France had to pay high reparations, which weighed heavily on the country. But the real tragedy took place inside. Even during the war, a radical movement arose in Paris, the Paris Commune. It wanted a people's government, social reforms, and a revolution beyond the revolution. She ruled in the capital for 2 months, but government troops bloodily crushed her. Thousands of communards were shot or deported, and the wounds of this civil war remained felt for a long time. Despite this difficult hour of birth, the Third Republic established itself. It was characterized by instability, changing governments, and party struggles, but it lasted longer than any republican experiment before. France learned to exist without a king or emperor and created a political system based on elections and parliaments. At the same time, a phase of modernization began. The economy recovered surprisingly quickly, industry and trade grew, and Paris continued to develop into a metropolis. But the loss of Alsace and Lorraine remained an open wound, a constant pain that shaped the politics and thinking of the French. The longing for revenge, the revanche pour l'Alsace-Lorraine, determined foreign policy and was later to play a central role in the First World War. The War of 1870-71 had humiliated France, but it had also produced a republic, albeit tottering. It was a new beginning, born of defeat and suffering. France had lost its role as Europe's leading power, but it was not broken. In the decades to come, it was to seek its place anew, in competition with the German Reich, in the struggle for colonies, in the dispute over democracy and identity.
Chapter 16. France in the First World War. When the First World War broke out in 1914, France faced a test that surpassed anything the country had experienced in the 19th century. The defeat against Prussia in 1870 was still a painful memorial, and the desire for revenge for Alsace and Lorraine lay like a constant shadow over politics. Now the opportunity presented itself, but the price France had to pay was immeasurable. The war began with a catastrophe. Germany had carefully prepared its attack and did not march directly against France's eastern border, but through neutral Belgium. The strategy, called the Schlieffen Plan, was to take Paris in a coup d'état. French soldiers who went to war in colorful uniforms with red pants were mowed down by modern German artillery and machine guns. The initial battles on the border ended in bloody defeats. But in September 1914, the French managed to turn things around. In the Battle of the Marne, they stopped the German advance a few kilometers from Paris. Taxis that took soldiers to the front saved the capital. The front froze and stretched from the North Sea to the Vosges. The war of movement turned into a war of position that was to last 4 years. The French army, the poilus, the bearded frontline soldiers, experienced the war as a hell of trenches, mud, and endless artillery strikes. Names such as Verdun or the Somme became synonymous with horror and suffering. Verdun 1916 was perhaps the most symbolic battle. For 10 months, the French defended the fortress against German attacks. The phrase, "Ils ne passeront pas," you won't get through, became the motto of the resistance. Hundreds of thousands died on both sides without the front moving decisively. The home front suffered as well. Millions of men were at the front. Women had to take over factories and fields. Industry was converted to war production, and everyday life was marked by hunger, grief, and deprivation. Entire regions in the north of France were occupied and plundered by the Germans. Nevertheless, France persevered. The war became a national struggle for survival. The Republic, which had been marked by political disputes in peacetime, moved closer together. Government, parties, and people backed the goal of winning the war, whatever the cost. In 1917, however, the country came to the brink of collapse. After costly offensives, soldiers at the front refused to obey, and mutinies shook the army. But the new commander-in-chief, Philippe Pétain, stabilized the situation by sparing the soldiers, putting defense before offensives, and promising them better supplies. The decisive breakthrough came in 1918. The United States had entered the war, bringing fresh troops and resources. Together with British and American allies, the French managed to repel the German attacks and finally launch the counteroffensive. On 11 November 1918, the war ended with the Armistice of Compiègne. France had won, but the price was immeasurable. More than 1 million French soldiers had been killed, and millions more were wounded or traumatized. Entire areas in the north of France were devastated, villages wiped out, fields turned into lunar landscapes. The Grande Guerre, as the French call him, left deep scars in the country. With the Treaty of Versailles, France regained Alsace and Lorraine and could feel like a victorious power. But the memory of the suffering prevailed. The war had sacrificed a generation, and the trauma shaped society. France never wanted to experience such horror again, and yet it would only be 20 years before it was drawn into an even bigger war again. Chapter 17. Between the Wars, Crisis, Culture, and Threat. When the guns fell silent in 1918, France breathed a sigh of relief. And yet the victory was bitterly bought. The country had won the war and regained Alsace-Lorraine, but it was exhausted, scarred, and devastated in many regions. Entire swaths of land in the north had become wasteland. Millions of graves reminded us of the price of victory. The land of the poilus, the simple frontline soldiers, was at the beginning of a new era, but the past did not let it go. The 1920s became a decade of contrasts. On the one hand, there was mourning for the lost generation, those young men who had fallen in Verdun, on the Somme, or in Champagne. Almost every family had to mourn deaths, and a memorial to the fallen was erected in every village. On the other hand, however, society wanted to live, enjoy, forget. Paris became the capital of the world in the Année Falls. Jazz sounds filled the bars. Artists and writers from all over the world flocked to the Seine. Names such as Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Josephine Baker made Paris a symbol of an exuberant culture. Politically, however, the Third Republic remained weak. It was a system of numerous parties that joined forces in changing coalitions and just as quickly fell out again. Governments changed every few months, and confidence in the stability of the state was limited. Nevertheless, France managed to rebuild its infrastructure and strengthen its economy in the 1920s. But this upswing was fragile. With the Great Depression of 1929, France also fell into turbulence. Factories closed, unemployment and poverty increased, and discontent grew. Society became polarized. On the one hand, left-wing movements, trade unions, and communists grew stronger, while on the other hand, right-wing, nationalist groups gathered that despised the parliamentary system. Street fights in Paris were not uncommon. At the same time, the threat from outside intensified. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, began to rearm itself. In France, the fear of another war lived on constantly. The Maginot Line was built, a mighty fortification along the German border that was considered insurmountable and intended to protect the country. But the psychological wound of the First World War also led to a deep longing for peace. Many French people wanted to avoid being drawn into a war again at all costs. The 1930s were therefore marked by uncertainty. In 1936, the Popular Front under Léon Blum won the elections, an alliance of socialists, communists, and radicals. For the first time, a left-wing majority was in power, which introduced significant social reforms. Paid holidays, the 40-hour week, more rights for workers.
These achievements gave hope, but they also met with fierce resistance from conservative forces and could not overcome political instability. When Hitler took power in Germany and his regime became increasingly aggressive, France found itself in a quandary. On the one hand, they saw the danger, but on the other hand, the country was divided, economically weakened, and paralyzed by the memories of 1914 to 1918. Many hoped that concessions to Germany could prevent a new war. So France went into 1939 with mixed feelings. It was a country that, on the one hand, radiated culturally, gave birth to Parisian nightlife, avant-garde art, fashion, and literature. On the other hand, it was a politically torn country, insecure and threatened, which could not close its eyes to the growing danger. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, it was clear that France would join the alliance with Great Britain and go to war again. A war that no one wanted, but that no one could prevent. Chapter 18. France in World War II. When World War II began in September 1939, France entered the war with Great Britain against Germany. But the first few months were strangely quiet. At the front, behind the mighty Maginot Line, the French soldiers waited, while in the west hardly anything moved. This drôle de guerre, the strange war, conveyed a deceptive sense of security. Many believed that the fortifications would stop Germany and that a new world war could perhaps be avoided after all. But in May 1940, everything changed. The German Wehrmacht began its attack, not head-on against the Maginot Line, but via Belgium and the Ardennes, where France had hardly expected a breakthrough. Within a few weeks, the French army was overrun. Millions of refugees streamed south. German tank columns raced through the country. On June 14, 1940, the Germans marched into Paris. France was defeated before it could defend itself properly. On 22 June 1940, Marshal Philippe Pétain signed the armistice. France was divided. The North and West were under German occupation. The South remained formally independent, with headquarters in Vichy. But even this so-called Vichy regime was only a puppet that collaborated with the Germans. Pétain presented himself as a savior who wanted to save France from even greater suffering. But in reality, he adapted the country to the occupation policy and had Jews persecuted and resistance fighters brutally fought. But not all the French surrendered. Soon the resistance emerged. A diverse network of fighters, spies, printers, and ordinary citizens who worked underground against the occupiers. They distributed leaflets, organized acts of sabotage, helped persecuted people to escape, and prepared attacks. In London, General Charles de Gaulle called on the French to resist in his famous radio address on 18 June 1940. France has lost the battle, but not the war, he said. For many, he became a symbol of free France. The years of occupation were marked by deprivation, fear, and mistrust. Food was scarce, rations determined everyday life, and the Gestapo spread terror. At the same time, a rift emerged in society. Some collaborated with the Germans out of opportunism, fear, or conviction, while others risked their lives to fight. This split left scars that remained long after the war. The turning point came in 1944. After the Allied landings in Normandy on 6 June, the liberation of France began. American, British, and Canadian soldiers fought their way through the bocage landscapes, supported by French resistance fighters who appeared openly in those days. On August 25, 1944, the Allies marched into Paris, accompanied by the French 2nd Armored Division under General Leclerc. The capital rejoiced when Charles de Gaulle walked along the Champs-Élysées and celebrated the liberation. France was free, but the price was high. Hundreds of thousands had fallen, countless towns and villages had been destroyed, and the memory of collaboration and betrayal was painful. Nevertheless, reconstruction began immediately, and with it, the will to make France a strong nation again. France emerged victorious from the war, albeit a weakened one.
It had overcome the ignominy of the defeat of 1940, reinvented itself in the resistance, and retained a voice in the world through de Gaulle. But the future remained uncertain, because the country was faced with the task of reorganizing itself after years of occupation, division, and internal division. Chapter 19: Post-War Period and the Fifth Republic. When the guns fell silent in 1945, France was faced with a new beginning. The country was liberated from the war, but it was also deeply exhausted. Cities were in ruins, the economy was ruined, millions of people were dead or uprooted. And inside, the period of occupation had left deep divisions. Between collaborators and resistance fighters, between those who had survived and those who had lost everything. General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of Free France, initially took the lead. It was he who had embodied the resistance in London and preserved the honor of France, and he was now the central figure in the reconstruction. Under his leadership, a provisional government was formed that was to pave the way to democracy. The Fourth Republic was founded in 1946 with a new constitution, a strong parliament, and a weak president. But it soon became apparent that this system was unstable. The Fourth Republic suffered from the same problems as the Third: countless parties, changing coalitions, and governments that often remained in office for only a few months. Although it was possible to push ahead with Reconstruction, also with the help of the Marshall Plan from the USA, political uncertainty remained. At the same time, France began to lose its colonial empires. In Indochina, they fought against the independence movement, which finally culminated in the defeat of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. In Africa, and especially in Algeria, the peoples also rose up against colonial rule. The Algerian War became a trauma, a brutal, bloody conflict that not only shook the country in North Africa, but also divided France itself. In this crisis, Charles de Gaulle returned. In 1958, he was called to the top again to prevent the imminent collapse. He took the opportunity to fundamentally change the Constitution. And so the Fifth Republic was born, a system that still characterizes France today. The president was given strong powers, he became the center of power, while Parliament lost influence. De Gaulle himself became the first president of this new order. Under his leadership, France regained stability. He ended the Algerian War, even if the farewell to Algeria was painful, as hundreds of thousands of French settlers and their descendants had to leave the country. He strengthened national independence, built France's own nuclear weapons, and pursued policies that were not entirely subordinate to the United States or the Soviet Union. France should appear self-confident again, have its own weight in world politics. The post-war period was also a time of economic upswing. The Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years between 1945 and 1975, saw a France that industrialized, modernized, and grew. New factories were built, highways were built, cities grew. The standard of living rose. Many people moved into modern apartments, cars and televisions found their way into households. But not everything was harmonious. In 1968, one of the greatest social upheavals of the 20th century occurred in France. Students protested against the rigid universities, workers stopped work, millions went on strike. Paris was marked by barricades, and the country was on the verge of revolution. Although de Gaulle succeeded in restoring order, events showed that France was in deep internal change. After de Gaulle, other presidents took power, but the Fifth Republic proved its stability. France remained a democracy that adapted to changing times and maintained its place in Europe. With the end of the colonial empires, the country transformed itself into a modern nation that looked back on its past but also sought new paths. Thus, the post-war period was an epoch of transition for France. From wounded country to modern state, from colonial power to European nation, from the crisis of the Fourth Republic to the stability of the Fifth.
And it paved the way to the present, in which France was to play a central role in the European Union and on the world stage.
Chapter 20. France Today: Democracy, Europe, and World Power in Transition. France in the 21st century is a country that looks back on thousands of years of history and at the same time stands in the middle of the challenges of the present. Gaul, the empire of the Franks, the land of kings, revolutions, and empires, has become a stable democracy that plays a key role in Europe. But like any nation, France is in a constant state of change, shaped by political, social, and global developments. The Fifth Republic, created by Charles de Gaulle in 1958, still exists today. It has proven to be surprisingly resilient, even if it has been repeatedly shaken by crises. Their presidents, from de Gaulle himself to François Mitterrand and Jacques Chirac to Nicolas Sarkozy, François Hollande, and Emmanuel Macron, have each shaped French politics in their own way. They all had to master the balancing act of preserving the traditions and expectations of a proud country on the one hand and responding to the challenges of a globalized world on the other. Europe has always been a central field. France was a co-founder of the European Community, which later became the European Union. Together with Germany, it made a decisive contribution to the European unification process. The Élysée Treaty of 1963 made the Franco-German partnership the engine of integration, and Paris is still considered one of the capitals of Europe today. But the European role also brought tensions. Many French fear losing national sovereignty, while others see the EU as a guarantor of peace and prosperity. Internally, France is a modern, pluralistic society. It is proud of its culture, its language, and its republican values of freedom, equality, and fraternity. But it is also a country of contrasts between city and country, rich and poor, tradition and modernity. The integration of immigrants, especially from the former colonies, is one of the biggest challenges. Social tensions, questions of identity and religion have repeatedly caused debates in recent decades. At the same time, France remains a world-class cultural center. Paris is still considered a city of fashion, art, and literature. French cuisine, films, philosophy, and music have a worldwide influence. The Eiffel Tower, the Louvre Museum, the Côte d'Azur, or the castles of the Loire attract millions of visitors from all over the world. In foreign policy, France is asserting its place as a world power. It is a member of the United Nations Security Council, has nuclear weapons, and is militarily active in various regions of the world, especially in Africa and the Middle East. It seeks a balance between its role as a leading European power and its claim to act independently on the world stage. But the challenges are great. Globalization, climate change, migration, and social inequality pose difficult tasks for politicians. Again and again, there are protests, be it by trade unions, students, or movements such as the Yellow Vests. France is a democracy full of life, with passionate debates and a society that never stands still. In this way, today's France presents itself as a country shaped by its history, but not frozen in it. The freedom struggles of the Revolution, the splendor of the Sun King, the victories and defeats of Napoleon, the sufferings of the world wars, all this lives in memory and shapes the national consciousness. But at the same time, the focus is on the future, on Europe, on the world, on the future. France remains a nation of contrasts, a country of pride and diversity. Its history is full of splendor and tragedy, full of victories and defeats, full of upheavals and renewals. And that is precisely why it is so fascinating. Because if you want to understand France today, you have to know its history, from Gaul to the present, from the kings to the Republic, from the Revolution to the European Union. A country that has fallen again and again, and has risen again and again, remains a formative force in Europe and the world today.